Hey there, sleepless rabble. Come closer, get comfy, let your phone fall face down like it's ashamed of itself, and let me take over for a while, because our freak show goes on. Tonight, we're stepping into a very special kind of Beauty and the Beast case. Only this time, the Beast wasn't just ugly on the outside. He was ugly where it actually counts. The kind of ugly that doesn't wash off. The kind that thinks a woman's life is something you can own, control, and punish when she dares to walk away. And before we go any further, two things. Because I'm not interested in lazy stereotypes. Not every MMA fighter is violent. Most of them train hard, respect discipline, and keep their aggression exactly where it belongs in the cage, under rules, under control. And working in the adult industry does not make someone less human. It doesn't make them disposable. It doesn't make violence against them a moral lesson. It makes them a person with a job. That's it. So if you're here for excuses, this is not your bedtime story. If you're here for the truth, told quietly, with a little razor blade irony, welcome. Quick thing, if you're enjoying the darker side of history, crime, and human behavior in a voice that doesn't shout at you like a documentary on caffeine, tap like, hit subscribe, and stick around. It helps the channel more than you'd think. And I want a comment from you. Sleepless rabble. What time is it where you are right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? That cursed hour where you start rethinking every decision you made since 2011? Tell me. Alright. Get comfortable. Breathe slow. Let the room go soft around you. As always, we start at the beginning. Jonathan Paul Koppenhaver was born on November 30th, 1981, in Simi Valley, California. It was a normal upbringing location, the kind that rarely comes up later unless someone is trying to retrofit meaning into it. His early environment did not push him toward extremes. It offered structure, routine, and a version of stability that many people grow up with and then forget about. His father worked as a police officer for the Los Angeles Police Department. His mother was trained as a nurse and later stayed at home. This mattered in a very basic way. Rules existed. Authority existed. There was no ambiguity about how adults were supposed to function or how behavior was supposed to be regulated. This was not a household where boundaries were unclear or constantly negotiated. There is no reliable evidence that Koppenhaver was particularly troubled as a child. No confirmed reports of early violence, no documented pattern of cruelty, no school records that later read like warnings that everyone missed. He does not appear in available accounts as academically gifted, nor as chronically disruptive. He seems to have moved through school without distinction, neither excelling nor failing in ways that would attract attention. Teachers did not describe him as exceptional. Peers did not describe him as memorable. He was present, but not remarkable. According to later biographical summaries, his mother struggled with substance abuse during parts of his childhood. As a result, Jonathan sometimes took on responsibility for his younger siblings. This detail is often framed dramatically after the fact, but stripped of interpretation, it describes something fairly mundane. A child noticing that situations do not always resolve themselves. Someone stepping in because no one else does. For most people, this results in practicality, not pathology. When Koppenhaver was 13 years old, his father died of a heart attack. Jonathan reportedly attempted CPR and was unable to revive him. This was a traumatic experience, and there is no reason to minimize its emotional impact. Losing a parent at that age leaves a mark. It introduces grief early and reshapes family dynamics in ways that are rarely clean or simple. but it does not dictate future behavior, and it does not create a moral exception for what comes later. What stands out about his childhood is how little it insists on interpretation. There is stress, but also normality. There is loss, but also structure. There is responsibility, but not abandonment. Nothing here demands that violence must follow. Nothing here removes agency. Nothing here creates a narrative that forces later outcomes. This matters because the story that is often told afterward relies heavily on implication. That something must have gone terribly wrong early on. That the signs were always there. That the ending was baked into the beginning. The available information does not support that comfort. Instead, what emerges is something less dramatic and more inconvenient. A person who grew up knowing what rules look like. Someone who was not raised without limits. Someone who understood authority well enough to later resent it. The absence of an obvious early explanation does not soften what follows. It sharpens it. Because if the groundwork did not predetermine the result, then what happens later cannot be assigned to fate, background, or circumstance. It belongs to behavior, to patterns that develop over time, to choices repeated until they stop being choices and start being habits. By the time Jonathan Koppenhaver moved from childhood into his teenage years, and then into early adulthood, there still wasn't anything mystical about him. No dark prophecy, no special mark. What did start to become obvious was something much more ordinary and, in its own way, more pathetic. He handled resistance badly. He didn't just dislike being told what to do. He seemed to take it personally, as if a boundary set by someone else was a direct attack on his status. In the places where most people learn to cope with correction, he tended to experience it as humiliation. A teacher redirecting him, a coach demanding discipline, an adult insisting on rules. These weren't neutral moments to him. They were power tests, and power tests had to be won. Not with argument, not with patience, but with pressure. It wasn't the kind of anger that burns itself out and leaves someone embarrassed. It was the kind that made him feel bigger for a moment, which is exactly why it kept showing up. People around him later described the same themes: quick escalation, impulsiveness, a tendency to turn minor friction into confrontation. The trigger didn't need to be serious. It could be a remark, a slight, a calm down, a refusal. The specific issue barely mattered. What mattered was the feeling of being limited. When he felt limited, he pushed back harder than the situation required. That was the pattern. And the pattern had a purpose. Aggression, for him, wasn't just noise. It was a shortcut. If you make the room uncomfortable enough, someone usually backs off. If you raise the temperature, the other. Person starts thinking about ending the interaction instead of insisting on the boundary. It's a simple system. It doesn't require intelligence. It requires willingness. He had that. This is where the boundary problems stopped being a vague personality flaw and started becoming a lifestyle. He learned over time that escalation often worked. And when it worked, it reinforced itself. If consequences arrived slowly or landed softly, the lesson wasn't, don't do it again. The lesson was, you can get away with it, which is a dangerous education for someone already inclined to treat force as a solution. As he entered adulthood, that tendency began appearing in the places it usually ends up. Police reports, charges, probation terms. Public reporting and biographical summaries described an assault case connected to him in Las Vegas in the late 2000s, with allegations involving choking and a victim losing consciousness. The outcome described in those accounts was probation and community service. For someone with a healthy relationship to limits, that would have been a warning and an invitation to change course. For someone like him, it was more likely a confirmation that physical escalation was survivable. Later reporting also tied him to bar-related violence and felony assault trouble around 2010 in San Diego County, involving incidents with people whose job is literally to enforce boundaries. Staff, bouncers, the human version of no you can't. The details varied depending on the source, and some versions were messier than others, but the outline remained consistent. Ordinary setting, confrontation, escalation, fallout. He kept arriving at the same destination because he kept using the same route. What made this stage of his life grimly predictable was the way the story was often reframed afterward. Men like this rarely describe themselves as aggressors. They describe themselves as respondents. They were disrespected. They were provoked. Someone else started it. The language shifts just enough to keep the ego clean, even when the behavior is not. It's a neat trick, and it works on people who don't want to look too closely. There was also something almost comic in how unoriginal it all was. This wasn't some complicated inner world. It was the small logic of entitlement. I shouldn't have to tolerate this. I shouldn't have to back down. If I push hard enough, I won't have to feel powerless. The irony is that it exposed the opposite of strength. Real strength can take a no and keep moving. His version needed the room to bend because he couldn't. By the end of this period, aggression wasn't a rare accident in his life. It was an available tool used quickly, defended afterward with the same recycled explanations. And once someone experiences aggression as effective, once it buys silence, space, compliance, the next move is almost inevitable. He starts looking for a place where that trait isn't treated as a problem, but as a skill. As he got older, Koppenhaver gravitated toward the kind of environment that rewards people who don't handle friction well, as long as they can wrap it in discipline. Combat sports gave him that wrapper. A gym didn't ask him to be patient, emotionally literate, or charming. It asked him to show up, do what he was told, and hurt less tomorrow than he hurt today. For someone who kept treating conflict like a personal attack, that structure was convenient. It offered him a lane where intensity wasn't awkward. It was the point. Training also gave him something he'd been reaching for in every argument: control. In a gym, control had a clear definition. You learned ranges, timing, pressure, when to explode, and when to wait. You learned that fear could be managed, that pain could be tolerated, that other people could be pushed backward if you knew how to apply yourself. The gym didn't turn him into a new person. It gave his existing instincts a system, and systems feel like permission. There was an identity upgrade in it too. A young guy with a temper is just exhausting. A young guy with a temper and a fight camp is suddenly intense. The same qualities that made him hard to deal with in normal settings could be rebranded as dedication. He could be obsessive and call it focus. He could be aggressive and call it competitiveness. He could be controlling and call it wanting to win. It was a neat transformation, mostly because people love a storyline that sounds like self-improvement. The physical side mattered more than the sport itself. His body became evidence. He didn't have to convince anyone with words anymore. He could walk into a room and let the shape of his shoulders do the talking. The threat didn't need to be spoken out loud to be understood, and that's the kind of power that appeals to people who hate being questioned. When you're used to escalation, it's comforting to carry a shortcut with you everywhere you go. In a functional world, training humbles you. You get submitted by someone smaller. You get tagged by someone quicker. You learn respect the hard way, because the hard way is unavoidable. With Koppenhaver, the sport seemed to offer something else, a stage where he could keep the parts of himself he liked, and interpret the rest as someone else's problem. If he lost, it could be blamed on timing, judging, bad luck, the wrong camp, anything that protected the ego. If he won, it confirmed the whole worldview. Dominance was proof, dominance was truth, dominance was identity. The gym also created a social hierarchy he could understand. There were rankings, sparring partners, coaches, reputations. You didn't need subtlety to climb inside that world. You needed drive, toughness, a willingness to be uncomfortable, and the ability to push past limits. He had those, and once you have them, you can start mistaking them for character. That's the trap with combat sports when someone is wired like this. The sport can be a container, but it can also become an amplifier. A container holds something safely. An amplifier makes it louder and more portable. If aggression already feels like a solution, learning how to apply it efficiently doesn't cure the impulse. It professionalizes it. It makes it look respectable. It teaches you how to do damage with technique, and then call it training. Over time, the gym doesn't just become a place you go. It becomes the place where your self-image lives. You're not Jonathan anymore when you're walking out of there. You're a fighter. You're someone who can handle pain. Someone who can make other people panic. Someone who doesn't need to back down. That identity is intoxicating if your sense of self has always been fragile under pressure. And once the body becomes the argument, conversation becomes optional. Disagreement becomes less about facts and more about posture. People start choosing their words carefully around you, not because you've earned respect, but because you've made the alternative unpleasant. It's a cheap kind of influence, but it works often enough that it starts to feel like status. Combat sports gave him structure, and it gave him a mask that looked like discipline. It also gave him a way to turn his worst instincts into something that could be applauded. And after enough applause, the next step was obvious. He didn't just want to train. He wanted to be someone the world had to notice. Jonathan Koppenhaver didn't just want to fight. He wanted to be something. And Jonathan wasn't going to cut it for the kind of self-image he was trying to sell. Jonathan sounded like a guy who might return a library book. Jonathan sounded like someone who could be told to calm down and might actually consider it. Jonathan sounded like a person. So he built a character. He chose the name War Machine, and then did the thing people do when they're deeply committed to a reinvention. He made it official, legal, on paper, as if a court document could turn a personality trait into a destiny. It wasn't a nickname other people gave him because it fit. It was a label he picked for himself, like he was choosing a flavor of energy drink. There's something revealing about a grown man looking at the world and deciding the problem is that his name doesn't sound violent enough. Plenty of fighters kept their normal names and still managed to win. Plenty of fighters had stage names that were playful, clever, even ironic. This one went for War Machine, which landed exactly where you'd expect. Loud, self-serious, and about as subtle as a punched wall. The rebrand was the point. A legal name change isn't a casual decision. It's paperwork, time, effort. It's a person saying, I want everyone, including the government, to address me as a weapon. That's not confidence. That's performance. The kind of performance that tries to solve insecurity by making it intimidating for other people to notice. From there, the persona started doing the work his actual personality struggled with. It gave him a shortcut past awkward things like self-awareness. If you call yourself War Machine, you don't have to explain why you're intense. You don't have to justify why you're aggressive. You don't have to learn how to handle disrespect, because you've already declared that disrespect is an act of war. The name lowered the bar for his behavior and raised the volume on everything else. And this wasn't just about what got announced at fight events. It bled into how he carried himself. When someone chooses a persona like that, they aren't simply trying to be memorable, they're trying to lock themselves into a role. They want the world to expect certain things from them so they can stop wrestling with choices. If the world sees you as a war machine, then you can treat ordinary human restraint like it's beneath you. You can act out and blame the brand. You can threaten and call it being real. You can confuse dominance with identity and act offended when people don't applaud. The most predictable part was how the persona also functioned as armor. War Machine didn't have to take criticism well. War Machine didn't have to look small when he lost. War Machine didn't have to admit he was wrong. That would have required being a person again. And he clearly wasn't interested in that. A persona like this doesn't exist to express who someone is. It exists to protect them from being seen. It also gave him a convenient excuse to lean into violence as something aesthetic. Violence as a vibe. Violence as branding. A fighter trains. A fighter competes. This guy wanted the violence to be part of the packaging. Part of the image. Part of the everyday presentation. He wasn't satisfied with doing the sport. He wanted the sport to justify the personality. You could almost watch the logic forming. If he could make aggression look like a brand choice, then people would stop calling it a problem. There's an ugly little trick hiding inside that logic. If your identity is built on being dangerous, then any pushback feels like someone trying to disarm you. And if you're emotionally invested in being dangerous, disarmament feels like humiliation. That kind of person doesn't evolve toward calm. They evolve toward escalation, because escalation proves the identity is still real. The name change also told everyone around him what to expect, whether they wanted that or not. Friends, partners, strangers. People weren't dealing with Jonathan, a guy who could be negotiated with. They were being asked to deal with a walking billboard for intimidation. It's exhausting, and it's intentional. When you force people to take your aggression seriously before you've earned any respect, you save yourself the trouble of developing actual character. And of course, it played well in a culture that sometimes mistakes loud masculinity for depth. A stage name like that attracts a certain kind of attention. Some people find it ridiculous and keep their distance. Others treat it like proof of toughness. The dangerous part is that either reaction still feeds the machine. Ridicule can be rebranded as jealousy. Admiration can be treated as entitlement. Either way, the persona grows. At some point, the difference between act and self starts to blur, especially for someone who already struggles with limits. If you wear the mask long enough, you stop noticing it's a mask. You start making decisions to protect the brand. You start interpreting disagreement as disrespect. You start treating relationships like they're supposed to orbit you. You stop thinking in terms of consequences and start thinking in terms of image. That's what made this reinvention so telling. It wasn't creative. It wasn't clever. It was a loud, deliberate commitment to a worldview where force mattered more than restraint, where intimidation counted as influence, where the ability to hurt people was treated like proof of importance. He didn't just rename himself. He announced in advance the kind of man he wanted permission to be. He had enough talent to be taken seriously, and just not enough to become what he wanted to be. Koppenhaver's fighting career sat in that familiar MMA middle zone. Skilled, dangerous on the right night, capable of a highlight, but never consistently dominant in the way that turns a fighter into a permanent fixture. He wasn't a tourist in the sport. He trained, he fought, he won plenty, and he could absolutely hurt people for a living. The problem was that the sport doesn't reward the idea of danger. It rewards repeatable results, professionalism, and the ability to keep your own chaos contained. For a brief moment, he got the kind of exposure fighters dream about. Reality TV cameras, a UFC opportunity, a stage big enough to convince yourself the world was finally lining up behind your name. He won at the TUF finale, delivered a knockout that looked great in a highlight package, and suddenly there was a version of the story where he became a real UFC presence. That's the intoxicating part of early success. You don't just win a fight. You win permission to imagine your future as a straight line going upward. Then the sport did what it always does. It corrected him. The next step was not a steady climb. It was a hard reminder that a single impressive night doesn't make you untouchable. He lost quickly to Yoshiyuki Yoshida at UFC 84, and losses like that do two things. They expose holes in your game, and they expose holes in your ego. Plenty of fighters take that moment and quietly get better. They go back to the gym, work on the gaps, accept the hierarchy, rebuild. With Koppenhaver, the public tone that followed leaned less toward humility and more toward grievance, like the world owed him a smoother trajectory. That's where the career began to split into two parallel realities. In reality, he was a competent professional fighter who moved through promotions, won fights, lost fights, and never reached the level where the sport had to keep him. He fought outside the UFC, had solid stretches, and built a record that looked respectable for a working fighter. Good enough to stay in the ecosystem, good enough to be booked, good enough to be paid. That's the honest version. In his head, it seemed to be something else. A story of being held back. A story of being underestimated. A story where his true potential was always just one more opportunity away, conveniently located in the future, where it could never be tested today. And that's where the ego inflation really started to rot the foundation. Because if you treat every setback as injustice, you stop learning from it. You don't improve, you explain. You don't adjust, you argue. You build a relationship with reality where the only acceptable outcome is the one that flatters you, and everything else becomes someone else's fault. The judging was wrong, the matchup was wrong, the timing was wrong, the promotion didn't see what it had. The world wasn't ready. All of it worked as a protective layer over a simpler truth. He was good, but he wasn't special in the way he needed to be. There's also the psychological trap of being almost. Almost keeps you hungry, keeps you delusional, keeps you talking like a future star even while your actual career looks like a sequence of restarts. Almost lets you live inside the fantasy without confronting the finality that comes with fully failing. And when your identity depends on being the guy who's about to break through, the last thing you can afford is quiet acceptance. So the image had to get louder. It's worth saying this plainly. A lot of fighters have egos. That's normal. You don't walk into cages repeatedly without some degree of confidence, bordering on self-deception. The difference is what that ego is built on. In his case, it increasingly seemed to be built on intimidation rather than achievement. Showing the world he was dangerous mattered more than showing the world he was disciplined. Being seen as a threat mattered more than being seen as reliable. And reliability is what makes careers in major promotions. Talent gets you in. Reliability keeps you there. His time around the UFC didn't turn into a stable run, and the accounts around that period suggested friction, public comments, public posture, the kind of attitude that doesn't make employers feel relaxed about investing in you long term. MMA organizations don't care how intense you are if you're difficult to manage. They'll tolerate a diva if the diva is a champion. They'll replace you quickly if you're a headache with a highlight reel. Outside the UFC, the career continued in that same uneven rhythm. Fights happened, wins happened, losses happened, opportunities appeared and then vanished. A stable upward arc never really formed. And when a fighter keeps falling short of the status he craves, there are two ways it usually goes. Either he accepts the reality of being a solid professional and builds a life around that, or he doubles down on the persona that promises greatness later. He doubled down. Over time, the gap between his actual achievements and his self-concept started to feel like an injury he needed to defend at all costs. Every reminder that he wasn't a star became an insult. Every limit felt personal. And in a personality like this, perceived insult rarely leads to quiet self-work. It tends to lead to louder performance, harsher reactions, bigger claims. By the time his fighting career was winding down, what he had was a resume that said legit fighter and a self-image that demanded something closer to unstoppable force. The sport refused to confirm that self-image. It kept giving him the kind of results that belonged to a capable, mid-tier pro. Enough success to keep him believing, enough failure to keep him angry. And anger, when it doesn't have a cage to live in, goes looking for another place to land. By the time the War Machine name was stamped onto documents and posters, Koppenhaver had already run into the problem his brand couldn't solve. Reality kept being stubborn. He could fight. He could look dangerous. He could have nights where the story seemed to click into place. But the sport never promoted him into the role he thought he was born to play. His record stayed respectable. He won enough to keep getting booked and to keep telling himself the breakthrough was coming. He lost often enough to keep that breakthrough permanently next. In MMA, that's a very specific kind of purgatory. You're good, you're paid, and you're also replaceable. The cage didn't care about your self-image, and promoters didn't care about your feelings. They cared about who sold tickets, who showed up, who could be trusted to be professional on the week that mattered. He didn't seem built for that middle lane. He wanted the world to treat him like a star while his career looked like a working fighter's career. A mix of wins and losses, a few memorable moments, and long stretches where you were just another name on a card. The mismatch produced a constant low-grade grievance. When things went well, it was proof he was special. When things went badly, it was evidence he was being denied what he deserved. That was where the ego started inflating faster than the resume. He talked like someone who had been robbed, even when the sport had simply given him normal feedback. A loss wasn't a lesson. It was disrespect. A tough matchup wasn't part of the job. It was sabotage. If an organization didn't move him upward, it wasn't because he hadn't earned it. It was because they didn't get him. The story always had a villain, and the villain was usually whatever stood between him and the status he felt entitled to. It didn't help that his persona depended on being feared. Fear is a brittle kind of currency. It makes you feel important, but it doesn't make you secure. You need it refreshed. You need it confirmed. So the performance had to stay loud. The name had to stay heavy. The posture had to stay aggressive. In that sense, the War Machine identity wasn't just branding. It was maintenance work. If the image softened, the insecurity underneath would show. The practical result was a career that looked like motion without a rival. Different promotions, different runs, different attempts to restart the narrative. He could still win fights, and he did. He could still claim he was on the verge of something bigger, and he did that too. But the big stage never settled under his feet long enough to match his self-concept. The irony was simple. He demanded star treatment while struggling with the ordinary emotional weather of the job. MMA is a profession that humiliates you in public as a routine feature. If you can't absorb that without turning it into a personal war, you don't develop. You harden. You become a person who needs the world to cooperate with your fantasy, because the alternative is admitting you're just a capable fighter in a sport full of capable fighters. He had tasted the main stage just enough to make it addictive. One televised win could keep a person fed on hope for years. He had the early knockout at the TUF finale, then the quick submission loss that followed, and then the quiet slide out of the UFC ecosystem. That sequence could have produced humility. Instead, it seemed to produce a belief that he had been misread, mismanaged, shortchanged. Outside the UFC, he kept fighting and collecting proof that he could win. But the proof was never the kind that changed the sport's hierarchy. A decent record was not the same thing as relevance. He moved through promotions, insisting each stop was the moment the world would finally see it. Bellator gave him another platform. It didn't give him a crown. So he compensated the way insecure men often do. He built noise around the numbers. He talked bigger than he fought. He leaned into the persona harder than the performance. The louder he became, the more he signaled the thing he never wanted to admit, that the sport would not love him back. He chased the feeling of being almost there because it let him stay loud without having to be proven right. Almost meant the next contract would fix everything. The next camp would unlock him. The next fight would force respect. It kept him performing confidence like a job, even when his actual career was asking for quieter math. And if the math didn't flatter him, he treated the math as the enemy. So, in the spring of 2013, on a photo shoot, Jonathan Koppenhaver met Christy Mack. It wasn't a dramatic how we met story that begged to be romanticized. It was work. A set. People doing their jobs. And Christy was already established in her own lane when he walked into it. Her real name was Christine Mackenday. She came from Indiana, and the early part of her life didn't come preloaded with a scandal soundtrack. Later profiles described a fairly ordinary path. School, a normal job, a young marriage that didn't last. Then she left that version of her life and started another one. This time with far more control in her own hands. She moved to Miami, started modeling, and eventually built a career in adult entertainment. You can feel however you want about that industry, but the reality of it is still work. It still requires consistency, negotiation, time management, and a kind of emotional armor most people never have to develop. Christy Mack was a stage name, but she was never a stage prop. She was a public figure before this case ever existed. She had an audience, attention, criticism, strangers projecting fantasies onto her, and strangers feeling entitled to judge her like it was a hobby. And she kept functioning anyway. That alone takes a specific kind of toughness. The practical kind. The type that shows up when you've got a schedule to keep and bills to pay while the internet tries to turn you into an object. She was also, very deliberately, a fitness model. Training wasn't a casual accessory in her life. It was structure, routine, discipline. She worked out consistently and treated her body like a professional tool, because it was. That matters for two reasons. First, it's part of who she was as a person. Someone who built a career through self-management, not luck. Second, it's part of why this story hit so hard later. When you've built your life around physical discipline and self-direction, having your body brutalized isn't just injury, it's an attack on the very thing you've worked to control. By the time she met him, she already had something he didn't: stable visibility. Her name was known. Her image was recognizable. Her career existed without needing anyone's permission. And that is exactly where a quiet power imbalance can begin, even before anything overt happens. Because when a man's identity depends on being the center, a woman who is already the center of her own life can feel like a threat. Her success isn't just cool, it becomes a mirror. Her independence becomes a reminder. Her attention becomes something he wants access to, and then resents when it doesn't automatically become his. Christy later described being sick around that period. Pneumonia was mentioned, and she said Jonathan offered to come to her hotel to look after her. They ate pizza. They talked. It sounded simple, even comforting, and that detail matters because it's real. Relationships that later turn violent rarely start with a warning label taped to the front. They often start with care that feels safe, especially when you're tired, vulnerable, or just relieved someone is being gentle. None of this is here to decorate the beginning. It's here to keep the record straight. She was a whole person before the violence, a working woman with her own career, her own routines, her own public life, and the kind of self-discipline that doesn't need a stage name to look impressive. After the assault, that public life didn't protect her. If anything, it meant people watched and talked while she had to do the slow, brutal work of surviving. Her injuries required multiple surgeries. Her recovery was long. Healing, in a case like this, isn't a neat before and after. It's medical appointments, reconstruction, pain, exhaustion, and the private psychological grind of trying to feel like yourself again when someone else has forced an after onto your body. And she didn't stay silent forever. Later, she spoke publicly and became active in speaking about domestic violence. Not as a slogan, not as a performance, but as someone who understood that visibility can be turned into something useful. She shifted attention away from the man who wanted to be a spectacle and toward what this actually was: violence, control, and a survivor whose life did not begin at the moment he tried to destroy it. So when her name enters this story, it stays what it should have been all along: the name of a real person. Not a label, not a plot device. A public figure with her own career and discipline, whose existence was never supposed to be reduced to what a man did to her. What mattered now wasn't just who Christy was, it was what happened once Jonathan got access to her life. Because a relationship like this didn't turn into a control system overnight. It usually arrived wrapped in the early phase packaging. Attention, intensity, that feeling of being chosen. At the beginning, he showed up as someone caring, present, protective. It was the kind of behavior that can feel like safety when you're tired, sick, or simply relieved that someone isn't treating you like a surface. Then the tone shifted, the way it often does when attention stops being a gift and starts being a leash. Christy's career and visibility were part of her independence. That independence was not a neutral fact inside this relationship. It was a constant reminder that she didn't need him to be real, successful, or seen. And for a man who already struggled with limits, a woman with her own momentum wasn't just a partner. She was a problem to solve, something to manage, something to bring under control so he could feel stable. Jealousy became less of an emotion and more of a method. It wasn't simply, I'm insecure. It expressed itself as monitoring, questioning, inserting himself into decisions that weren't his, turning everyday interactions into interrogations. The underlying message stayed the same even when the wording changed. You belong to me, and your life should reflect that. The control didn't have to be physical to be effective. It could be emotional pressure. The silent punishment when she didn't comply. The mood swings that trained her to anticipate what would keep things calm. The kind of tension that makes you edit your own behavior just to avoid a scene. Over time, that's how isolation begins. Not always with explicit, you can't see them, but with the slow creation of consequences. Until it feels easier to shrink your world than to deal with the fallout. And he didn't handle boundaries like an adult. When she pushed back, when she tried to keep her autonomy intact, he didn't interpret that as normal. He treated it as defiance. People like this don't hear no as information. They hear it as disrespect. And once that frame is in place, everything becomes a justification for escalation. At some point, the relationship ended. The split mattered, because breakups are often where control-obsessed partners unravel. A relationship can tolerate a lot of bad behavior as long as the controlling person still believes they have access. Once access is removed, the dynamic changes. The goal stops being manage her. It becomes reclaim her, or failing that, punish her for refusing to be reclaimed. This is where the classic pattern shows itself. Possession dressed up as love, obsession rebranded as passion, entitlement sold as heartbreak. He didn't lose a relationship. He lost control of a person he had started to treat like property. And that kind of loss doesn't produce sadness in someone like him. It produces rage with a narrative attached. After separation, the boundary violations didn't magically stop. They often intensify. That's when you see repeated attempts to reinsert influence. Messages, appearances, pressure, the emotional whiplash of switching between charm and hostility. One moment it's regret, the next moment it's blame. The goal isn't resolution. The goal is to pull the other person back into engagement, because engagement is a form of access. There's also a specific maneuver that shows up in relationships like this. Turning the victim into the aggressor. The language shifts. He's the one being hurt. He's the one being treated unfairly. He's the one who just wanted to talk. It's a performance that tries to flip the roles so he doesn't have to face what he's doing. If she resists, that resistance becomes proof that she's cruel. If she sets a boundary, the boundary becomes evidence she's hiding something. The victim becomes the problem by definition. Some accounts and reporting suggested there may have been other incidents before the final escalation, described after the fact rather than formally documented at the time. Those claims have circulated in various forms. If they weren't officially reported, they should be treated as reported information, not courtroom certified fact. What matters is the shape of the dynamic, because the dynamic was already clear. Jealousy, dominance, repeated boundary violations, and a man who treated her independence as an offense. So by the time August 2014 arrived, this wasn't a random explosion out of nowhere. It was the end stage of a familiar progression. The controlling partner loses access, interprets that loss as humiliation, and decides that the only acceptable outcome is to take control back by force. And once someone reaches that point, the relationship stops being a relationship in any meaningful sense. It becomes a situation. Christy's life kept moving, because that's what happens when you've built a career that depends on showing up. Shoots, training, maintaining her image, keeping the public-facing machine running. She had momentum that didn't pause just because a man with a fragile ego wanted it to. Her visibility wasn't a reward someone handed her. It was the result of work she repeated, day after day, even when it was boring, even when it was exhausting, even when strangers treated her like an object they'd paid for in their head. And that steady visibility did something very simple to Jonathan. It made him feel smaller. Not because she was doing anything to him, not because she was provoking him by existing, just because her life didn't revolve around his moods. And he couldn't stand the reminder. A woman with her own audience and her own routine doesn't naturally orbit a man who needs constant reassurance. She doesn't exist to manage his insecurity. But that's what he wanted anyway. The imbalance became clearer as time went on. Christy's career was public. People recognized her, followed her, talked about her, wanted access to her. That kind of attention comes with noise, and noise is kryptonite to controlling partners. It means there are parts of her life he can't supervise. It means there are messages he can't police and interactions he can't rewrite. It means the world keeps touching her existence without asking him first. For someone who mistakes possession for love, that's unbearable. Jonathan's side of the equation wasn't improving either. His fighting identity had already started wobbling. The big stage hadn't become a permanent home. The persona was louder than the resume. And when a man builds his entire self-worth on being the dangerous one, any sign that he's losing status feels like humiliation. Humiliation is the emotion he never learned to carry quietly. He needed it to be someone else's fault. So the tension didn't come from some dramatic external villain. It came from a basic mismatch. Christy had independence that looked like success. Jonathan needed control to feel successful. Those two needs don't negotiate. They grind. This was the point where the relationship stopped being about two people and started being about access. Who had it? Who didn't? Who could take it away? Who could force it back? Christy's visibility meant she had options. She had people around her. She had a life that continued beyond him. That's not disrespect. That's adulthood. But to someone like Jonathan, it registered as rejection. And rejection to him wasn't a feeling. It was a threat to the identity he was trying to protect. The control attempts became more obvious. The emotional pressure got heavier. The atmosphere thickened in the way it does when you're dealing with someone who makes every boundary into a personal insult. You could feel the relationship narrowing. Fewer choices without consequences, fewer freedoms without questions, fewer moments that stayed calm unless she actively managed his reactions. That's the quiet part people don't see from the outside. They only notice the explosion later. Inside, it often feels like living with a weather system you're expected to predict. And when Christy's public life grew, the control problem grew with it. The bigger her visibility became, the more he had to fight the fact that he couldn't own it. He couldn't rename her. He couldn't rebrand her. He couldn't make her success feel like his. He could only try to shrink her world until it fitted inside his comfort zone. But her world wasn't built to shrink. This was where the power shifted in a way he couldn't tolerate. Christy pulled away from the relationship, and the distance itself became the trigger. Not because breakups are inherently dangerous, but because breakups remove access. And access was what he had been treating as his right. Once access is removed, a controlling partner doesn't experience "we're done" as information. He experiences it as defiance, a challenge, a humiliation delivered in public, even if it happened in private. So the situation tightened. The stakes rose. The sense of entitlement got uglier. And the closer he got to losing control entirely, the more desperate he became to prove he still had it. That was the atmosphere that formed around them as the calendar moved toward August 2014. An unstable man, a woman trying to live her own life, and a growing sense that he was not going to accept the answer he'd been given. August 2014 arrived with that tense, brittle quiet that comes after a breakup, when one person has accepted reality and the other is still arguing with it like it's a customer service issue. Christy had moved on. She had her work, her training, her life. Whatever was left between them was supposed to stay in the past, where exes belong. Jonathan didn't treat it that way. He treated separation like a temporary technical error. Like the world had made a mistake and it was his job to correct it. On the night of the attack, he didn't show up to talk. He didn't show up to apologize. He didn't show up to get closure. That favorite phrase people use when they mean, give me access. He forced his way in. He entered a home where he did not belong, driven by the oldest and ugliest idea in the book. If he couldn't have control willingly, he'd take it. Christy was not alone. Another man was there, a friend. That mattered because it collapsed the fantasy Jonathan had been feeding himself. In his head, she was supposed to be paused, waiting, regretting, available. Seeing her life continuing without him wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation. And for a man built on entitlement, humiliation doesn't land as sadness. It lands as rage wearing a costume. What happened next wasn't a snap. It wasn't a single moment of lost temper. It was sustained violence. He attacked the man first, then went after Christy with a level of force that left no space for romantic delusions about passion or jealousy. This wasn't love. This was punishment. Christy was beaten so severely that the injuries were later described as life-threatening. She suffered extensive trauma, including multiple fractures, and she would need surgeries and a long recovery afterward. The details are known, and they are horrific. But the important thing here isn't to catalogue her injuries like trophies. The important thing is to understand what the attack communicated. He was trying to erase her autonomy through pain. He was trying to make her body the place where his control could be enforced. There were also sexual assaults during the attack. And that fact matters because it strips away any last attempt to frame this as a fight. Sexual violence is not a fight. It is domination. It is the most direct form of stating, you do not own yourself. You are not allowed to refuse me. Your boundaries are an illusion I can break. It isn't impulsive. It is intentional. This is where the War Machine persona finally revealed what it really was. Not a fighter's brand. Not a tough guy identity. Just a loud costume for a small, predictable type of man. The one who can't tolerate losing access to a woman and mistakes that lost for theft. The one who thinks a breakup is something you retaliate against. The idea that he didn't know what he was doing doesn't survive the reality of the scene. This wasn't a shove in a hallway. This wasn't a single punch. This was a sustained assault that nearly killed her, carried out in a space he invaded after a relationship had already ended. Whatever story he told himself afterward, the message of his actions was already clear. Christy survived. That word gets used too casually sometimes, like it means the crisis ended. It didn't. Survival was the beginning of a different kind of ordeal. Medical treatment, surgeries, healing, pain, fear, the mental aftermath, and the long process of living with the knowledge that someone decided your life was negotiable. And while a body was being kept alive by doctors, Jonathan did what men like him often do. He ran. Because even after all that performance about being a machine, he still understood consequences perfectly well when they were pointed at him. That was the night the story stopped being toxic relationship and became what it always was underneath. Control, entitlement, and violence finally unmasked. And once the attack ended and she was in emergency care, the next phase began. The scramble to find him, the evidence he left behind, and the way he tried to rewrite himself as the victim, while the real victim was fighting to heal. Afterwards, he didn't stay to face what he'd done. He ran. And of course he did. The whole tough guy act was built for cameras and controlled environments. Real consequences don't care about your stage name. Real consequences show up with handcuffs and paperwork, and suddenly the war machine concept gets very quiet, very fast. In the hours and days after the assault, he went into the mode he always fell back on when reality didn't flatter him. Narrative control. Not control of the situation, he'd already lost that the moment he fled, but control of the story. The tone shifted to self-pity in performance, the way it does when a man can't stand being seen as what he is. He made posts online, wrote like he was the wronged party, framed himself as betrayed, provoked, misunderstood. The usual script. If you've ever watched someone try to talk their way out of a disaster they created, you know the voice. Dramatic, wounded, righteous, and completely allergic to accountability. It was obscene in its timing. While Christy was in no state to speak at all, he was out there broadcasting. She was dealing with emergency medicine, trauma care, and the reality of having to survive what happened minute by minute. He was busy making sure the internet heard his feelings. That contrast tells you everything about him that any psychological analysis ever could. When her body was fighting to stay alive, his priority was his image. He didn't just run, he tried to leave behind a fog, confusion, doubt, something he could point to later and say, see, people were talking. People weren't sure. That's why men like him perform so hard in public when they're guilty. If you can't change the facts, you try to pollute the atmosphere around them. But the facts didn't need his permission. There were injuries, there were witnesses, there was a timeline, there were physical traces. There was the simple, unglamorous reality of law enforcement doing what it does when a scene is that brutal and that clear. The case started moving without him. And the more he posted, the more he didn't look like a man having a breakdown from remorse. He looked like a man trying to manage the optics of being hunted. At some point, the performance ran out of road. You can only cosplay the victim for so long when you're actively evading arrest. Eventually, it stops being my side of the story and starts being what it is. Flight. He stayed on the move for several days. Reports at the time described a search that widened and tightened, with police tracking him down through the kinds of practical details that don't care about your self-mythology. You can rename yourself War Machine all you want, but you still need places to sleep, money to move, devices to post from, and a body that eventually gets tired. He was found and arrested a few days later in California, and when that happened, the story snapped back into its proper shape. Not the one he'd been trying to write online, but the one built out of evidence and consequences. The man who had performed dominance was suddenly just a suspect in custody, exactly as ordinary as every other violent offender once the costume is taken away. And that was the end of the running. Because after the chase comes the part he couldn't talk his way out of. Investigators assembling what happened piece by piece, medical findings documenting the reality he tried to drown in self-pity, digital traces catching up to him, witness statements hardening into testimony. The story stopped being something he could post about. It became something he would be judged for. Once he was in custody, the oxygen left his performance. Because the internet voice, the self-pity, the big dramatic you don't understand posts, none of that mattered anymore. There was a scene. There were injuries. There were witnesses. There was time-stamped reality. And reality is rude like that. It doesn't argue with you, it just sits there and waits for you to explain it. Investigators did what investigators always do when a case is this violent and this recent. They treated it like a clock that had to be rewound. They went back through the night step by step, starting with the simplest questions. Who was there? What happened first? What happened next? What did the scene look like? What did the victims look like? What did the suspect do afterwards? What did he leave behind? What did he take with him? And the reason this case became so hard to spin wasn't a clever detective moment. It was the sheer amount of evidence that a brutal attack produces when it happens in a real home, to real bodies, and then ends in real emergency care. Violence like that doesn't stay theoretical. It leaves marks. It breaks things. It creates medical records that don't care about anyone's side. Christie's condition alone generated a trail that couldn't be massaged into ambiguity. Hospital staff documented injuries the way they always do, clinically, precisely, with images and notes and timelines that don't require imagination. There were fractures, trauma that required surgeries, the kind of damage doctors don't describe with emotional language because they don't need to. When physicians say something was life-threatening, that isn't rhetoric. It's a classification. Her friend, the man who was there that night, also had his own account and his own injuries. 2 victims meant 2 narratives that could be compared, 2 sets of details that could be cross-checked against the scene. That matters, because controlling offenders love one-on-one situations, where it's just their word against the victims. This wasn't that. This was a situation where another person was present, assaulted, and left behind to describe what happened. Then there was the physical scene itself. Crime scenes don't flatter anyone. They don't arrange themselves into a clean story. They just sit there with their messy, obvious truth, and investigators translate that truth into photographs, measurements, collected items, and reports. The scene helped tell a timeline, where the violence moved, where people were when it started, where it intensified, where it ended. It also helped rule out the kind of fantasy explanation offenders sometimes reach for later. The idea that everything was mutual or chaotic or a fight that got out of hand. Scenes like this tend to show direction, intent, pursuit. And then there was the digital trail, which in his case was practically a gift-wrapped confession of mindset. He had posted publicly while on the run. He had inserted himself into the narrative in real time, making statements that could be time-stamped, archived and used to show consciousness of guilt, attempts to justify, attempts to redirect blame. A lot of offenders do this because they can't stand silence. They need to feel present. They need to feel controlling even while fleeing. The result is usually the same. They end up leaving behind evidence with their own fingertips on it. So the case built itself in layers. Medical documentation, witness accounts, scene documentation, digital traces, a timeline that didn't depend on memory alone because it was supported by records. And when those layers align, it becomes very difficult for a defense to stand up in court and sell a clean alternative reality. That's why this part of the story is so cold, so procedural, and so devastating in its own way. Once the emergency was over and she was stabilized, the case stopped being about emotion and became about proof. About what could be shown, not what could be claimed. And proof has a nasty habit of shrinking loud men down to their actual size. Because now he wasn't War Machine. He was a defendant with a documented trail behind him, and a system in front of him that didn't care how intimidating he thought he was. The next stage wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Charges, hearings, evidence presented, strategies forming, and the long wait while the legal process prepared to do what he'd spent years trying to avoid, pin him to facts he couldn't talk his way out of. His case didn't need a genius twist to move forward. It had the kind of evidence that makes a courtroom go quiet, because there's nothing cute to argue with. When detectives and prosecutors started laying it out, the story became painfully simple. Timeline, injuries, witnesses, and his own behavior before and after. The medical documentation alone was the sort of thing that turns he said, she said into sit down. Photographs, scans, surgical reports, the clinical language that doesn't exaggerate because it doesn't have to. Add the witness who'd been there that night, add the scene itself, add the fact that he fled, and add the online posts where he tried to pre-chew the narrative for the public. At that point, you weren't dealing with a mystery. You were dealing with a man trying to out-talk a pile of facts. He did what men like him tend to do when the walls close in. He didn't suddenly become reflective. He didn't suddenly become honest. He tried to manage perception. He leaned on excuses that made him sound like the victim of a misunderstanding, as if there was a reasonable interpretation where a home invasion, a brutal assault, and sexual violence were just a messy night that people were being dramatic about. That approach only works when the damage is subtle. This wasn't subtle. There's also a specific kind of arrogance that shows up right here. The belief that if you keep insisting long enough, the world will get tired and let you off. He'd lived a long time with consequences that were delayed, softened, negotiable. Courtrooms are not gyms. Judges don't spar. Prosecutors don't get intimidated by posture. When the evidence is strong, the options narrow, and the performance stops being impressive and starts being embarrassing. So the case moved into the long legal grind. Hearings, motions, scheduling, arguments over what the jury would be allowed to hear. The usual slow machinery that feels endless when you're the one waiting. For Christy, that meant something most people never have to experience. Healing physically while knowing that the person who did it might spend years trying to make the process miserable. Being forced to revisit the worst night of your life through paperwork and procedure, while everyone else calls it due process and expects you to stay composed. Eventually, the path it took wasn't the cinematic one. It didn't end with him delivering a dramatic courtroom monologue that changed history. It ended the way strong cases often end, with him taking a plea rather than gambling on a trial where the facts would be spoken out loud in front of strangers. He entered a no-contest plea to multiple felony charges. That isn't a noble gesture. That's a strategic retreat when you realize the jury is going to hear things you can't charm your way around. Then came sentencing, which is the moment a lot of offenders finally run out of places to hide. The judge isn't interested in your persona. The judge isn't moved by your self-image. The judge looks at what you did, what it caused, what it will mean for the victim's life going forward, and what kind of risk you represent when you feel rejected again. And this is where his entire brand collapsed into a single, humiliating truth. For all the talk about being a machine, he was still just a man who hurt people and then tried to control the story afterwards. He didn't come across as someone wrestling with conscience. He came across as someone angry that the world was refusing to negotiate with his fantasy. The sentence reflected that. Life in prison, with a very long minimum before parole could even be considered, plus additional years stacked on top. In practical terms, it meant the door didn't just close. It locked, bolted, and had time added for good measure. Whatever he'd imagined his legacy would be, it ended up as a case file and a number he couldn't talk his way down. For Christy, the verdict didn't rewind anything. It didn't restore a body that had been broken. It didn't erase the surgeries, the pain, the fear, the long process of feeling safe in your own life again. What it did do was something smaller and more important than drama. It affirmed, officially, that what happened to her wasn't relationship chaos. It wasn't mutual. It wasn't a fight. It was violence, committed deliberately and punished accordingly. And once the sentence was handed down, another story began. One that didn't revolve around him at all. It was the story of what survivors do after the cameras leave. Rebuilding, speaking when they choose to speak, staying alive in a world that loves to turn women into cautionary tales. Meanwhile, he was left with exactly what his persona had never prepared him for. Silence, limits, and a life where nobody cared how loudly he insisted he deserved more. And then the world got very small. Prison has a way of stripping a man down to whatever he actually is when there are no cameras, no crowds, no brand, and no one impressed by his posture. The walls don't care. The routine doesn't care. The guards don't care. The other inmates definitely don't care. You can rename yourself into a weapon, but you still line up when you're told. You still eat when you're told. You still get counted like everyone else. The system doesn't negotiate with stage names. That's the part he was never built for. Limits that cannot be argued with. In custody, his reputation didn't make him powerful. It made him a case file with a sentence so long it basically became a personality trait. And men like him don't suddenly become calm when they lose control of the environment. They get busy trying to find new ways to feel in charge. Sometimes that looks like aggression. Sometimes it looks like constant friction. Sometimes it's petty. Sometimes it's explosive. Often it's all of the above, depending on who's watching. Various accounts over time described him picking up disciplinary trouble inside. That's not shocking. A man who spent his adult life treating no as a personal insult doesn't magically become adaptable because the no is louder. He may not have been able to dominate the system, but he could still attempt domination in moments, refusing to comply cleanly, getting into conflicts, pushing boundaries to prove he still had an edge. It's the same logic he used outside, just with worse lighting and fewer exits. And the irony is that prison is full of men who also believe they're special. So his old tricks didn't age well. The intimidation routine doesn't land the same when everyone around you has already met 10 guys who think they're the main character. Being tough isn't currency there. It's background noise. If anything, the louder you perform, the more you advertise insecurity. And insecurity in that environment is a smell people notice. That's where the religious angle tends to show up in stories like this. At some point, rumors started circulating about him leaning into religious narratives, presenting himself as changed, saved, redeemed. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Prison is a rumor factory and a reinvention studio, and religion can be both sincere and convenient. For some men, it becomes a real framework. For others, it becomes a vocabulary that makes them sound softer around parole boards or in letters. Sometimes it's both at different times, depending on what the man needs. But even if you grant the most generous interpretation, the problem remains the same. Belief is not accountability, and a conversion story is not restitution. You can have a spiritual awakening and still be the person who did what you did. You can read scripture and still be dangerous. You can talk about forgiveness and still never truly face what you took from someone else. Redemption, if it exists at all, isn't a costume you put on. It's an endless grinding behavior change. And the kind of harm he caused doesn't come with a neat, I found God exit sign. Inside, time does a very specific kind of damage too. It removes novelty, it removes distraction, It forces you to sit with yourself in long, empty stretches. Some people use that to finally grow up. Others use it to calcify. If you've built your entire identity around being feared, prison is a constant reminder that fear doesn't equal respect. And it doesn't equal freedom. It's just a reaction. And once your life is reduced to rules you can't bend, the only control you have left is how you respond to them. A man like him tends to respond badly. Even his old world didn't offer him much to hold on to anymore. The MMA scene moved on the way it always does. Fights happen, new names rise, and yesterday's chaos becomes a footnote. Promoters don't build a shrine to a liability. Fans don't keep the flame alive for a cautionary tale. The sport is brutal like that. It forgets you quickly unless you gave it a reason not to. And if you're waiting for the satisfying image of him finally understanding what he did, it usually doesn't arrive in a cinematic way. Men like this don't suddenly collapse into insight. They bargain internally. They reframe. They blame. They cling to whatever version of the story allows them to keep their ego intact. Because the alternative is unbearable. Admitting they chose to destroy someone, and the world responded by taking their life away from them. Prison didn't turn him into a myth. It turned him into what he always was beneath the branding. A violent man contained by a system stronger than him. And the next part of the story is quieter, but it matters. Because once the sentence was handed down and the doors closed, you could see what was left around him on the outside. Who stayed, who vanished, who spoke, who went silent, who wanted nothing to do with him once there was no benefit to pretending he was just complicated. That kind of silence tells you more about a man's real social world than any persona ever could. After the sentence, the noise around him didn't turn into outrage or a loyal chorus insisting the world had misunderstood him. It turned into something colder. It turned into absence. The people who had once benefited from his proximity stopped appearing. The acquaintances who had enjoyed the edgy aura of a fighter with a dangerous nickname didn't make a project out of standing by him when the nickname stopped being entertainment and started being evidence. That's one of the few honest things about reputation. It has a shelf life, and it expires quickly when it becomes inconvenient. His family life, such as it was in the public sense, didn't become a counter-narrative either. There was no sustained campaign of public defense that mattered. No visible family presence that reframed him as a misunderstood son, a good brother, a wounded man who made one mistake. What came through instead was silence. Whether that silence was shame, exhaustion, self-protection, or the simple recognition that there wasn't anything left to argue, it had the same effect. It left him alone with the facts. And that's the part he was never built to handle. Because men like this don't just want attention, they require it the way some people require oxygen. Attention reassures them that they still exist as a force, that people still orbit them, that their mood still has power over a room. Prison took away the room. The sentence took away the audience. The case took away the chance of being seen as controversial in a fun, profitable way. What remained was a violent man locked into a future where his name mostly came up as a warning. Even the MMA world, usually a place that can be forgiving about plenty of things if you can still fight, didn't have anywhere to put him. Gyms don't turn themselves into memorials for people who bring catastrophic attention. Promoters don't romanticize liabilities. Former training partners may have had complicated feelings privately, but the public posture was straightforward. Distance. The sport moved on the way it always does. The next card replaced the last one. New names arrived. Old ones disappeared. And his name didn't disappear with dignity. It disappeared with discomfort. He had once tried so hard to be a brand that people couldn't ignore. He'd wanted to be a presence, a symbol, someone you had to take seriously. In the end, the only version of him that lasted publicly was the one attached to a case that made people lower their voices. The kind of name that makes conversations go, yeah, that guy, and then quickly change direction. That's the thing he never seemed to understand. Fear and respect are not the same emotion. Fear can fill a room for a moment. Respect stays when the room empties. When the violence was no longer happening in a ring, when it was happening to a woman in a home, the tough guy framing died instantly. Nobody needed his persona anymore. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't marketable. It was just ugly. So what did he have left? A few scattered voices, maybe. The kind of people who always hover around fallen men because they enjoy proximity to wreckage. The kind of attention that isn't loyalty, just morbid curiosity. And then, beyond that, the long silence of ordinary abandonment. Because his relationships outside were not built on who he was as a person. They were built on what he could project. Danger, intensity, the illusion of importance. Once that projection turned into a court record, it stopped being useful to others. That's not tragic. It's accurate. It's what happens when your identity is constructed as a performance. Performances end, audiences leave, the lights come up, and suddenly you're just a man sitting with what you did. This kind of isolation isn't the romantic solitude some people imagine when they hear the word prison. It's not poetic. It's administrative. It's waking up inside a schedule that doesn't care, surrounded by people who don't owe you warmth, waiting for messages that don't come, learning that the world outside will keep spinning with or without your opinion. For someone like him, that's not just punishment, it's a kind of ego starvation. Because he wasn't only sentenced to time, he was sentenced to irrelevance. And while he sat inside that shrinking world, the other life in this story kept existing on the outside. Christy's life didn't become easy, and it didn't become private, and it didn't become tidy. She had to rebuild herself in ways he never had to imagine. She had to keep living with the aftermath in her body and mind, while he lived with it in the only place his control finally stopped working. That contrast is the quiet ending he never wanted. She stayed real, and he became a cautionary tale people mentioned once, then tried not to think about. And at that point, there was nowhere left for myth to hide. After the court dates faded and the headlines got bored, the real aftermath stayed exactly where it had always been. In Christy's body, in her day-to-day life, in the long stretch of time where survival stopped being an emergency and became a routine. She went through multiple surgeries, not the kind of procedure that fixes something and lets you close the book, but the kind that drags you through stages. Waiting, pain, swelling, follow-up appointments, learning what your face and jaw felt like now, learning what you could chew, how you slept, what hurt on which day, and how to keep functioning when your nervous system kept replaying a night. Your mind never agreed to store calmly. There was nothing cinematic about it. Recovery like that didn't come with a clean turning point. It came in small, stubborn increments that still cost her. And the part people rarely understand is how deeply this kind of violence tries to rewrite a person's sense of self. It wasn't only injury. It was the theft of safety. It was the knowledge that your home can be invaded, that your boundaries can be treated as optional, that your body can be attacked as a message. That's the kind of thing that changes how you walk to your car, how you hear footsteps in a hallway, how you judge strangers' faces, how quickly you flinch at tone. It doesn't end when the attacker is locked away. It lingers in the ordinary. She was also forced to carry the extra burden that comes with being publicly known. People talked, people speculated, people moralized. People tried to turn her job into a verdict, as if career choices changed whether a human being deserved bodily autonomy. That is one of the ugliest side effects of cases involving adult entertainment. The violence gets treated like content. The survivor gets treated like a concept. She didn't let that reduction stand forever. Over time, she spoke publicly about what happened and what recovery actually looked like. Not as a neat redemption arc, not as a motivational poster. More like a person insisting on the truth that surviving wasn't a single moment of courage. It was a long grind of medical reality and psychological fallout. She also became active in speaking about domestic violence, using the visibility she already had to drag attention back to the part that mattered. Not his image, not his excuses, not his stage name, the mechanics of control, the warning signs people ignore, the ways violence escalates when a controlling partner loses access. That shift mattered beyond her own life, because this case became a reference point for something people still refuse to accept until it happens to someone recognizable. When the perpetrator has a public persona and the victim is publicly visible, people suddenly stop pretending domestic violence is a private misunderstanding. They see it for what it is. Entitlement turning into punishment. Control turning into force. And Christy stayed alive through all of it. Not just medically, but socially, publicly. She continued to exist as herself rather than as the crime. That doesn't mean she moved on in the way people like to say when they want the story to be over. It means she kept building a life in the shape that was still possible while carrying the parts that had been damaged. It means she refused to let the most violent moment define the full narrative. Meanwhile, Jonathan's story shrank to a set of documents and a sentence. Whatever self-myth he'd tried to build with a name change and a persona collapsed into an unglamorous fact. He wasn't a tragic figure. He wasn't a misunderstood genius of violence. He wasn't a cautionary legend. He was a man who escalated, who couldn't tolerate losing control, and who chose to make a woman pay for his wounded ego with her body. The reason this matters is because people like him benefit from mystique. They benefit from the idea that they are unpredictable, that they snapped, that something rare and unrepeatable happened. It lets everyone else feel safe, because if violence is a lightning strike, nobody has to look at patterns. But this wasn't lightning. It was a process, a documented progression, aggression that became a tool, a persona built around intimidation, a relationship shaped into a control system, a breakup treated as humiliation, and finally, violence used as punishment. The steps were ugly, but they weren't mysterious. And the clearest way to deny him the last thing he wanted, importance, is to describe him accurately. Not as a monster, as a man, a predictable one, a violent one. The kind who took up too much space until the system finally took it away. And the reason Christy remained the center of the story wasn't because she needed to be saved by attention. It was because she kept proving something he never could. That a person can be brutalized and still insist on their own reality afterward, without turning it into theater. In the end, the strangest thing about Jonathan Koppenhaver wasn't his violence. It was his insistence on being seen as something bigger than what he actually was. He spent years trying to manufacture significance. The name change, the persona, the constant performance of being dangerous. It all had the same purpose, to make people treat him like a force of nature, like someone you couldn't judge by normal standards because he operated on some darker, more intense frequency. And then the court record arrived and did what court records do best. It flattened the theatre. What remained wasn't mystery. It was a documented escalation. A man who used aggression as a tool long before he ever met Christy. A man who treated boundaries like insults. A man who couldn't handle rejection without trying to turn it into punishment. When he lost control, he didn't collapse into heartbreak. He invaded a home and used sustained violence to take back what he believed he was owed. That's not a myth. That's not a legend. That's not even particularly original. It's a familiar pattern with a loud costume on top. People love to search for the real reason, because a real reason feels like a conclusion. It feels like closure. It lets you believe the world only breaks this way under rare, special circumstances. But there isn't a rare, special reason here. There's entitlement. There's resentment. There's the belief that dominance counts as identity. And there's the kind of cowardice that shows up when a man needs control so badly he'll destroy someone else's body to feel it for 5 minutes. If you look at his life honestly, you don't get a demonic origin story. You get a man who kept choosing the same response to friction until it became his only response. The sport didn't create him. The persona didn't create him. Those things just gave him a framework that made his worst instincts look like character. Christy's story, meanwhile, refused to end where his violence wanted it to. She didn't become a footnote. She didn't become a moral lesson. She didn't become an object for strangers to debate. She survived, and then she kept existing in public, scarred, changed, and still unmistakably herself. That doesn't balance what happened. Nothing balances it. But it does ruin his preferred ending, the one where the victim disappears and the perpetrator gets to loom. His sentence was long because the harm was real and the risk was obvious. And the most accurate thing to say about his future was also the least dramatic. He was removed from the world he kept trying to dominate. So if you're waiting for the satisfying final twist, the hidden monster, the secret tragedy, the grand explanation, you won't get it here. What you get is something colder and clearer. A man who made choices over and over until the final choice nearly killed someone who had done nothing except live a life he couldn't control. That's the ending he earned. And the reason her name stays at the center is simple. She was never his storyline. She was the person he tried to erase. He failed. He didn't just fail to erase her. He accidentally did the one thing controlling men hate most. He made her harder to reduce. Because after the courtroom, after the sentence, after the whole I'm a force performance collapsed into a number in a cell, Christy still had to wake up every day in a body that had been changed by someone else's entitlement. That's the part that never becomes tidy. The public loves a clean ending. Real life doesn't do that. Real life is appointments, surgeries, recovery plateaus, random pain, and the psychological aftershocks that show up in quiet moments when nobody is watching. And still, she kept speaking. Not constantly. Not as a brand. As a survivor who understood that attention can either be turned into spectacle or turned into leverage. She used her visibility to drag the conversation back to what this actually was. A relationship dynamic that escalated into control, and control that escalated into violence when the control was challenged. Not romance, not passion, not he just lost it. The boring, terrifying mechanics of it. That distinction matters because the he snapped story is a comfort blanket for everyone else. It lets people believe violence only arrives like a lightning strike. It lets friends say, he was always nice to me. It lets bystanders stay neutral, because neutrality feels safer than admitting they ignored a pattern. It even lets perpetrators hide inside a moment, instead of being seen as a process. He wasn't a moment, he was a process. You could trace him through the same shape over and over: entitlement, friction, escalation, blame, repeat. He didn't invent anything new. He just kept doing it until the scale became impossible to excuse. And that's why the War Machine name ends up feeling almost embarrassing in hindsight. He tried to brand himself as unstoppable, like some mechanical force beyond ordinary judgment. But what he actually revealed was the most ordinary kind of weakness. A man who couldn't tolerate being told no, and couldn't tolerate a woman moving on without him. That's not mythic, that's common. The only difference is that most men like that never make the news, because their victims aren't publicly known. The public aspect of this case also exposed a nastier truth. How quickly people tried to make Christie's job the story, as if her work somehow explained his violence. That move is one of the oldest tricks in the book. If you can drag a woman's sexuality into the spotlight, you can blur the moral line and pretend there are two sides. It's lazy, it's cowardly, and it is exactly the kind of fog men like him depend on, but the fog didn't hold. In the end, the system treated him as what he was: a violent offender who posed a clear risk. The sport forgot him because the sport always forgets liabilities. The persona died because personas can't survive hard evidence. And the only thing that lasted was the truth he tried to drown: that a human being survived him and refused to disappear. That's the part worth ending on, if you want an ending that's accurate instead of satisfying. Not the fantasy that justice fixes anything. Not the fantasy that prison erases damage. Not the fantasy that victims get a clean, inspiring arc. Just the reality. She stayed real, he stayed accountable, and the story doesn't belong to his ego. It belongs to what happened. And to the person who lived through it. Alright, easy now. If your eyes are getting heavy, let them close. If you're still awake, that's fine too. Just breathe slower, and let the room feel a little farther away. If you stayed with me until the end, tap like before you drift off, and subscribe if you want more dark stories told gently, without the shouty nonsense. And if you feel like it, leave me a comment. Just one word is enough. Awake or gone. Thank you for being here, sleepless rabble. Sleep if you can. Rest if you can't. And either way, I'll be right here when the freak show continues.